Thank you all viewers who have and listeners who are joined us for this special webinar on Kashmir hosted by Ziauddin Faculty of Law, Politics and Governance. I, Sajad Shah, will be your host for this session. As the director at the Center for Human Rights, we focus on highlighting and talking about the key issues prevalent in our society that affects humans and how law plays a role in securing certain rights people can rely on to that effect. It is unfortunate that today many Kashmiris in Kashmir cannot rely on the rule of law for their human rights. The struggle for basic fundamental rights has been one dating from the 15th century for them. In contemporary times, it was exacerbated in 1947 when India and Pakistan fought over the region and continued in a series of wars afterwards. The majority Muslim population has continued to struggle under an oppressive Indian government. Just over 2 years ago, on August 5th, 2019, Article 370 that granted some sense of autonomous status to the self-governance in Kashmir was ended by New Delhi. This original agreement was with Kashmir's previous ruler, the Maharaja, who agreed to the accession to India on its basis, some sense of self-governance, which is now non-existent. Today, on February 5th, we commemorate Kashmir Day, a symbolic day for people, especially in Pakistan, to express the solidarity with the people of Kashmir who continue to fight for their rights, which have gotten fewer and fewer since 2019. To discuss this particular time period and the specifics of the ground realities, we will be discussing a major report issued by Stoke White, a London-based law firm who recently filed a case in the UK against Chief Minister Amit Shah and Chief of Army Staff Manoj Mukund Naravane, and called upon the UK Metropolitan Police to issue an arrest warrant citing universal jurisdiction. The report highlights crimes against humanity that include torture, kidnapping, killing of activists, journalists, and civilians. Interviewing over 2,000 people, identifying hundreds of human rights abuses, this has been the single most documentational evidence to date since 2019. What are the implications of this report? Will it benefit Kashmiris struggling to gain international recognition for their cause? What is universal jurisdiction, and can other countries use this? To talk about all this, we are joined today by our panelists. Well, introduced with our chief panelist, Khalil Dewan. Khalil Dewan heads the investigation at Stoke White, and with over a decade of experience in human rights and civil liberties work, he joined the firm in 2019. Previously, he was with TRT Investigations and worked on numerous human rights investigations, including those with the International Criminal Court, and has been involved with them as well. Khalil is well-traveled and allows him to have an enriched perspective and adds value to team working on multiple jurisdictions and cases and investigations. Investigative human rights fieldwork is not only around Kashmir, but also includes Syria, Somalia, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand. He obtained his LLM, Masters of Law in International Law, at the School of Oriental African Studies in London. Thank you, Khalil, for joining us for this session. I will also like to introduce our next panelist, who is also an international law expert, Aisha Malik, who's based out of Lahore and is with the Research Society of International Law, RSIO, the primary think tank in Pakistan that is working on international law, where she leads the Conflict Law Center. And her work also includes work in Kashmir that has led to investigations and evidences to the numerous human rights violations in the territory that include not only the ones mentioned in the report, but many others, including home demolition, the challenges of COVID pandemic, and other issues. She studied law as an undergrad at Oxford University and holds a master's in legal and political theory and an LLM with a specialization in international law from the University College London. Last but not least, I'd like to add to our panel Alexander Lawson, our resident international law expert at Ziauddin University, who currently is serving as the director at the Center for International and Constitutional Law. He has taught at university level for nearly 25 years and currently teaches human rights and international law at the Faculty of Law, Politics and Governance. He graduated with an LLM in international law from Durham University. Without further ado, thank you everybody for joining. And I hope to have an enriching discussion on this really intriguing report that Khalil and Stoke White were able to publish and put out there. And I want to start the conversation, Khalil, to get us a perspective on what this report has within it. I mean, there's a lot of things that you mentioned, and all of us, we've kind of gone on and read it before we came to this, and the implications of this report and filing it with the UK Met. So tell us a little bit about the background, how this developed, what was the idea behind it, and the challenges that you faced in putting it all together. So just give us a brief introduction about this report.
Sure, thank you very much. First and foremost, I think it's important to understand and just to clarify that we filed the universal jurisdiction application with the UK Met, which included a major bundle of evidence, which incorporated video evidence, corroborated and validated using open source intelligence techniques, as well as human rights testimonies, which we then had our lawyers look over and standardize according to SRA in the UK. And then on the side of that, in 2021, we created an investigations unit. The reason why is because whilst we have experience in the International Criminal Court and we have filed 2 other universal jurisdiction cases, is that we felt we needed to do more in our investigations in particular countries. So the way it started really is we had a client approach the law firm, Wazir Mustafa's family. And I know that's a case that's quite well reported in the region. And we were already shocked. We didn't really know about it. And then we already had just finished our first investigation on France's botched airstrikes in Mali against a wedding, which killed some 19 civilians. And I made a decision that we will look into Kashmir, and that the client was sent over to us. And then we conducted a 1-year investigation on Kashmir. And we uncovered actually more than 2,000 testimonies. It was more like 3,500. But when it comes to the standardization to ensure that the testimonies are adequate enough to submit in a legal court or any mechanism, we had to ensure that they were effectively good enough to submit in the UK. And we went about our investigations utilizing open source intelligence techniques, utilizing satellite imagery, tracking down all forms of communications regarding the location of where we were investigating. So that was the Indian occupied as well as Pakistan territory in Kashmir. Majority of our cases, Indian occupied territory. And then we use traditional human rights methodologies, which is effectively interviewing a potential client, corroborating that information with 2-3 sources. It was a very lengthy process, but there were challenges as well. In my experience of investigating around the world, there were two countries in particular that were very difficult. I will first put Syria on the top, and second of all, I would say Kashmir, and purely because of the organizations working on the ground and the structures that are there to prevent any sort of human rights work or documentation, not just as a human rights investigator or a lawyer, but also just journalistically. It's very hard to operate there. And I will move into that later. So overall, we produced a public-facing report to provide a 360 primer with regards to all of the violations taking place. And that also dealt with non-legal aspects of the conflict as well, which I thought was very important. Because the SWI unit's main goal is to focus on violations which are taking place, which are not necessarily given the a focus, if you like, around the world. It's not really well reported on. So Mali and then Kashmir. And we actually brought out some themes which hasn't really been discussed before on Kashmir. So for example, structure of violence, the war on terror as an enabler of human rights abuses, Israel's link to Kashmir, the use of drones and a broader defense and security partnership with India over Kashmir, shutting down of journalism, and then something which is very, very important, needs to be explored immediately, is the impediments installed to prevent and disrupt NGOs, human rights monitoring organizations, from just doing their job. And it goes worse than, we've also have cases and testimony from families of lawyers who have been harassed, as well as abused, physically tortured, and in some cases even killed for doing their work en route back from Geneva. And that's in a nutshell what we have done. And I'm happy to give the mic back to you.
Thank you very much. And I think one of the things that you focused on was that you had mentioned that there was a lot of elements that weren't talked about before. And I think that's interesting. And I want to actually bring Aisha into this conversation, because I know, Aisha, you've done a lot of work on Kashmir and research. And aside from the torture and the extrajudicial killings, the disappearance of journalists and activists, these are kind of the crimes, but there are other issues and crimes that you were able to look at. One of the things that I found was very fascinating in the little bit I do know of research, there was an aspect of particularly targeting women, was the concept of the half widow, and how basically there's women who basically don't know about their husbands if they're killed or they've disappeared, and they're living in this limbo. And I thought that was quite interesting. And maybe you could shed a little bit more light, aside from these more prominent crimes that were mentioned by Khalil, there were other aspects that the Kashmiris face and other human rights violations. And perhaps you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to say that I found the report incredibly interesting. It made for in terms of the value added, in terms of like the new elements that you don't usually read about. The link between Israel and India and the tactics that they have used. And there are so many parallels and analogies between the two occupying people. So the tactics they use to subjugate people, the inhumanity shown towards their inhabitants of the occupied territory, and the aggravated use of terrorism. And maybe we can go into that in a bit more detail later on. But in terms of the other crimes, the kind of crimes looked at in the report, there are war crimes, there are human rights violations, and I would also argue that there are crimes against humanity. That's not a term used in the report, but I would argue that under the Rome Statute, all of the Shah element and all of the acts are also satisfied there. But you have so much in Kashmir which is going on. So torture, and the torture of young people, young minors and children, rape, sexual violence, pellet guns. Pellet guns is a huge, huge issue in Kashmir, the use of these indiscriminate weapons, and they're used as a matter of state policy for crowd control. And also the issue of enforced disappearances. You have this term called half widows, because people actually just do not know where their loved ones are, and the state won't tell them anything. And you also have you now have given rise to this as new state policy, which the Indian security forces have said is because of COVID, but we know that it's not. It's because these funerals since the time of Burhan Wani have become a kind of epicenter for disorder and protest, is where Kashmiris can congregate and they can really speak out against the terror inflicted upon them by the Indian state. And so what they've started to do is to not return the bodies of their deceased family members to the families. And they've also been burying them in mass graves. So people actually don't know where their lost ones are. They don't know what's happened to them. And that is something that under the laws of war, under Article 15 of the First Geneva Convention, they have a right to know. And they have a right to bury their loved ones in accordance with their religious obligations. And so that is not being done. So the list kind of goes on and on in terms of how much we can look at it in terms of preventative detention and the impunity. And I think that the main issue really, if we look at customary international law, and the thing that we're really wanting to push, and that is why universal jurisdiction is one of the main avenues through which we can push this, is the fact that you have impunity for any kind of perpetrations which go on in occupied Jammu and Kashmir through Article 7 of the ASFPA. And you see that we have had 0 prosecutions, and the OHCHR published a very, very good, very well-documented comprehensive report in 2018. It was updated in 2019. I was really, really hoping that they would update this again. And I think that that's something that we need to push for. And they even asked for a mission, a fact-finding mission to go to Kashmir and figure out what's going on and, you know, even more thoroughly document the abuses. And so you have had a real push in recent years, which we haven't seen before. We haven't really seen the UN, we haven't seen the OHCHR come into Kashmir and publish these very good reports. And now we're seeing a lot of special rapporteurs talking about it. One of the underlying themes of all of these violations is the whole notion of collective punishment. And you see that again as a parallel with what's going on in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories, where you have the internet being shut down, where you have, you know, humanitarian services not being offered, where you have homes being demolished because they just say that actually we think that there might be a gunfight with non-state groups there, so we're going to burn the entire house down. We don't know if the militants are actually hiding in these homes, but actually will be an example to everyone who might be hiding them, harboring them, supporting them. And so the whole notion of collective punishment you can see throughout: internet blockades, homes being burnt down, the refusal of returning people for burial rights, returning dead bodies for burial rights, and pellet guns. Again, all of these forms of crowd control, they're all collective punishment. And so I think that's where we can see the analogy and the parallels drawn with Israel, and where I think it will really benefit us from drawing that analogy. And I actually think that the report was so interesting for me because I did not know that you are having such a close collaboration with Mossad, with counterterrorism, Israeli counterterrorism, that they're actually conducting these interviews or, you know, torture techniques in Jammu and Kashmir. That's something new that I got from the report, which I haven't read about before. And it was shocking. It was quite startling to see that, you know, we've seen this grow over the years, this closer and closer bond, the Hindutva ideology and the Zionist ideology kind of birthed from the same seed. And now we're seeing that play out on the ground as well.
You know, that's really interesting, that that dynamic, that, you know, not just politically, but there's ideological connections that could
Yeah.
There's no doubt that, you know, of course, the Israeli experience in occupation has been much more well versed than versus other nations. So there is, if another country would like to occupy a region, they could learn a lot from the Israelis in that process. But bringing in, of course, now we're bringing in other countries. We're bringing in this idea of international kind of essence of not only the occupation, but now the seeking of justice. And I wanted to actually bring Alex on this question because, you know, Stoke White, they approached the UK Met citing something called universal jurisdiction. And this is obviously, you know, based on the crimes against humanity and so forth. So perhaps you can shed light for our viewers and listeners what this universal jurisdiction is, and if this had existed before, why now? And is it something new, or it always existed? And it's because now maybe it's the documentation of this evidence that can be used in a court case. What is universal jurisdiction? I would start with that, and how powerful can it be using this report, knowing that you've read it as well, in actually bringing some sort of action?
Okay, so universal jurisdiction is one of the principles of international legal jurisdiction, for which public international law can be invoked. I don't think I need to go through all of them, but the simplest one that you're familiar with is territorial. That's the number one basis of jurisdiction. Pakistan has jurisdiction over Pakistani territory, which includes all of the land and out to 12 nautical miles into the sea, etc. And that's a very well-known, understood idea about jurisdiction, that it's territorial. If you commit a murder in Pakistan, then the Pakistan state is the one that will punish you, right? There are other principles, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I can if you want, but you know, some of them are quite complicated. At the other end of the scale from that, through some other principles, there is universal jurisdiction. And universal jurisdiction is actually a very simple idea. Any state anywhere can bring an action against the activities of another state. There doesn't have to be any linkage whatsoever between the two, right? Just recently, if you're familiar with this, you've seen that in in Germany, I think in the last 2 weeks, an individual was convicted of crimes against humanity in Syria. You can look this up. It's been very well documented. That's under universal jurisdiction. These activities happened in Syria. They had nothing to do with the German state whatsoever. The reason the German state was able to do anything is because they happened to have one of the people in their custody. One of these people, who was the alleged torturer, now proven torturer, had fled to Syria and sought political asylum, to Germany, sorry, I keep getting that wrong, and sought political asylum. As you know, Germany accepted a very large number of Syrian refugees voluntarily a few years ago. And most of those were genuine refugees, but unfortunately, some of them were in fact the bad guys, the torturers. So Germany was able to bring a prosecution, and in fact, they used crimes against humanity, which has already been mentioned, and they were successfully able to prosecute this individual. But again, there's a tiny linkage there in that they happen to have the guy in custody. But in fact, you don't even need that linkage. Having said that, that will tend to be the obvious way in which universal jurisdiction is exercised, that the guy that you're after is in your custody. Yeah, your police officers know that he is wanted for crimes against humanity. Your prosecutors prosecute him. Your judges and jury convict him, and then he's sentenced, right? But strictly speaking, any state can bring an action against any other state, anywhere, for any activity under universal jurisdiction. So you could imagine a state, again, that has no connection whatsoever with Kashmir, simply deciding to bring a claim based around the evidence that Stoke White had produced. And obviously what they want is the UK government to take it up. That's why they've sent it to the Metropolitan Police. But any government anywhere could actually look at this data and choose to bring a prosecution. In terms of where this comes from, it's certainly post-Second World War. There is an argument that says it may have been around before then, but it's definitely post-World War II. And in particular, the Genocide Convention of '48 actually states that the Genocide Convention has universal jurisdiction. Other crimes have been given universal jurisdiction either through some treaty basis, more often through a general approach of what we call customary international law. So crimes against humanity are deemed to be universal jurisdiction, war crimes. Torture is actually an offense on its own, which is universal jurisdiction through its own treaty mechanism, but often it's subsumed into crimes against humanity. So that's where it comes from. It may have been around before then. We don't know for sure because it's not something that was really discussed that much, but definitely since the Second World War and since the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals and some other developments post-World War II. The final question, I suppose, is why doesn't it happen very much? Because there's fantastic evidence here that suggests that there are things going on in Kashmir that are breaching international law and international criminal law, in particular international humanitarian law. So why isn't any state taking it up? And the answer is that states are generally reluctant to do it because of the political problem that it causes. That if you bring a claim under universal jurisdiction against the activities of another state, they will do the same thing to you, basically. And since most states have some skeletons in the cupboard, okay, they're not as big a skeletons as Kashmir or the occupied territories in Palestine, but most states do have some skeletons in the cupboard, as it were. That's why they're reluctant to do it. And that's why it's unlikely, in my opinion, that the United Kingdom will pursue this. So that's kind of the sort of where it comes from, the history of it, and where we are now.
Okay. Now, with that, I want to bring Khalil back into the conversation, because when we talk about universal jurisdiction and the case itself, and obviously the evidence that's collected to have created this case, I want to talk a little bit more specific about the report. Obviously, when you put this together, you've studied previous reports and evidences. Is there something more solid in these reports? One, I find it very challenging that the situation in Kashmir post August 5th, 2019, with the internet blackout, the access to people to be able to testify, perhaps you can shed some light on that. But is this evidence somehow like more stronger, and that now we can actually go for universal jurisdiction because this evidence is documented better? Or is this just something I'm kind of assuming here? Perhaps you can add some clarity on that. And is Stoke White prepared to kind of take this, other than outside the UK and possibly to the member European Union states, and apply it as well? Or can someone else, obviously, as Alex had indicated, also take this report and apply for universal jurisdiction in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that was fantastic, Alex. And yes, I would just like to mention that, you know, universal jurisdiction is effectively a mechanism. So when we did our investigation, we wasn't sure where we would go to complain. However, our clients were very much looking forward and trusting us to submit somewhere. We couldn't do it in India because the whole landscape is very difficult. It's rigged, and you know, within Kashmir or even occupied, it wouldn't make sense, as you can, number one, from the top layer of being in an occupied territory. But if we scratch beyond the surface, for those who may not know much about Kashmir, the whole law enforcement structure, as well as the judicial structures, is absolutely insane. You know, it's effectively lawfare when law is used as a tool for war, and furthering that via the law. That's been seen very clearly by SWI, I'm sure by others before us. And that also plays into the politics, which we didn't really get into, but we do have a lot of notes on whilst we're doing investigations. So I think the universal jurisdiction, we decided to submit in the UK because number one, we are based in the UK, and our clients do not need to be residents or nationals of the country. The UK's universal jurisdiction, they do require to have some sort of nexus in the UK, so for the client. However, it's not a strict requirement. That's similar to the ICC, and I'll come to that in a minute. And we believe that the standard that we went through to attain all of our testimonies, which is quite a mammoth of you know, a file submitting to the Met Office, would yield some good results, but it's yet to be seen. It's been handed over to an investigations officer. These things take a lot of time, as you can imagine. It's not dealt with in the same way as a domestic criminal case. The standards are a little bit more looser compared to domestic, but in the same time, the resources of the UK is not the same as well. So it's a smaller team, but growing in the last 2 years, I have seen. We have had communications with them since then, which seems to be going very positively. And I think the UK are looking into this file quite seriously, to be honest, compared to maybe the attitude before, and also some developments in Germany, as mentioned by Alex. And I think there is also maybe some political will to show that they are active on universal jurisdiction because of Germany's latest development.
They recently
and also just like
assigned an investigator, if I'm not mistaken, right? Perhaps you can also shed some words in respect to that.
Sure, yeah. So literally one day after we submitted, they assigned an investigator. Usually they don't do that. They might get back to us after a few weeks or even months. So that was quite reassuring for us, but also our clients. And I also believe that our second client, who is Ahsan Antal, who's a very well-known human rights defender. He's been defending human rights, you know, advocating for human rights in Kashmir, you know, since he's been existing in Kashmir. You know, everyone knows him. He was arrested 1 week before we went live with our case and published our materials, which is very concerning. And right at the top of our application was this notice that one of our clients has been detained. And we fear that he is actually being tortured. And there's been no news about this. And it's very, very concerning. Just coming back to the UJ. So in a nutshell, just to repeat, you know, it's, you know, regardless of where the crime took place, when it took place, or whom the crimes were committed by, it's actually a very clever mechanism to utilize more. And the question was raised, why hasn't anything been done before regarding Kashmir, legally speaking? And it's a very good one. I think everyone around the world is probably thinking when the case was filed, why is this the first legal action? There's been you know, many years of abuse taking place. And that's a question for the diaspora in Kashmir. That's a question for the NGOs that work on this. And that's also a question for lawyers working on human rights in general. I think there's a collective responsibility regarding why such things haven't been brought to the international arena And it's also important to mention the reason why we went for the UJ, because we could have very easily submitted information to the UN Special Rapporteur or the UN in general in one of their working groups. And we've done that previously with other countries, for example, in Egypt, the Emiratis, war crimes in Yemen. But India doesn't recognize the UN's work on Kashmir, which is something that's very, very important to highlight. Whenever the UN writes a report, they literally put out a statement, just kind of dissociating themselves with any form of summary or conclusion with regards to abuses taking place. And this is also very worrying, because on one hand, the state wants recognition for its place in the global orders, but in the same time, they don't want to play, if you like, play ball with the international legal order. And that's very concerning. And that shows you how they're using lawfare. And it's very clear for when we're doing our investigation that we would face these problems. So this is actually the primary reason why we took the case to the UK, because we knew that, number one, when we were strategizing regarding the case, we had to be effective as possible for our client. First and foremost, we are a law firm. The investigations unit is part of the law firm, but what we do is secondary to the law firm. So we needed to really support our clients, which is, by the way, growing since we submitted. We've proved hundreds of people come forward, and we still have to document their case. And we're looking forward to take this further higher. But the UJ provided us an ability to put the agenda of Kashmir to the UK authorities, but in the same time, the Indian government not to turn a blind eye, because in 2024, 2 years from now, the UK government sent a memo to the Indian authorities to conclude a trade agreement. So strategically, we felt that if we were to put this on the table, a little bit of a thorn, I know, they would have to discuss this. And the universal jurisdiction application is not where we are going to stop. We have many, many ideas to continue throughout this year and the next year to utilize unique legal thinking to do things differently as well. So universal jurisdiction is a very new, as it's been around, as Alex mentioned, it's a very new tool for human rights defending, but we need to utilize that more strategically and see what else we can do. So in the UJ, we've also referred and invoked Criminal Justice Act within the UK, looking into torture, whilst torture might not necessarily be there, or judicial killings. We're trying to invoke other principles as well as the UK's principles to really push the boundaries of universal jurisdiction, because it's very new. And universal jurisdiction can change. Like in international law, we have customary practice. Over time, that can change. Similarly, universal jurisdiction can change. So Stoke White want to be at the forefront of making those changes. We've submitted many cases on international human rights, laws of war violations, international criminal law at the ICC. We have 2 cases pending at the ICC, one on Syria, one on Israeli Defense Forces for unlawfully attacking and conducting a raid on the Gaza flotilla boat in 2010, you may recall. Yeah, and we've learned a lot from, exactly, and we've learned a lot from that process. The politics, the international relations, the lawfare within the ICC as well. We have a lot to say. We haven't come out to say this because it's not our role as lawyers to talk about this. The politics, right? We have to stay impartial and serve our clients.
I just add something to that as well. That's okay. Which is that actually, the UK is one of the friendlier places where you could bring a universal jurisdiction claim. Right? The UK has accepted the idea of universal jurisdiction pretty much from the beginning. It allows for jurisdiction in some very strange circumstances through some statutes like the War Crimes Act of 1991 and things like that. And of course, there's Pinochet, which Pinochet was not strictly a case about this. Pinochet was a case about extradition. Pinochet was the dictator of Chile who ended up in London in 1999, and there was a warrant for his arrest from Spain. But okay, that's really just a case about deportation, extradition. But it did address international law issues. The UK is a signatory to the ICC. It's one of the better places you could bring a universal jurisdiction claim.
Right. Thank you for that, Alex. And I'm actually going to come back to you for another question of what Khalil mentioned here. But Aisha, I wanted to pull you in the conversation at what Khalil was mentioning, that this can be utilized in other spaces and other forums as well. And I was curious as to like the data that you obviously read within that report, combined with all the other data sets that we have. Is there any meaningful action? Can we actually see that? Can the people of Kashmir really expect something from this? Is it just another one of the series of different actions internationally that's going on? I mean, how do you see this report impacting this work for the Kashmiris to actually get recognition? Can we push some action in the ICC? What are some other things? I'd love you to shed some light on that as an international law expert.
Yeah, sure. So universal jurisdiction and it being taken up by a number of states is kind of a very exciting and interesting development in international law. Now, currently, we're seeing 16 countries, including Belgium, Spain, France, Germany, Argentina, taking this up and pushing for accountability. And that's a huge increase, from previous years. So it is very exciting to see how this will unfold in the future. And as mentioned, we've seen Germany and Belgium really go after members of the Syrian Assad regime who are within their territory. And I think for this to be a forum, that a vehicle for which we use for, the Kashmiri recognition of their right to self-determination, or even just a push for a lack of accountability where there has only been impunity for decades. What we need to do is really collaborate with CSOs on the ground. So civil society organizations like the Jammu and Kashmir Coalition for Civil Society, that does a lot of amazing work. They publish reports almost annually, and they're always witness testimonies. They're always talking about what the issues are that Kashmiris actually face on the ground, and to engage with UN mechanisms, such as pushing for this mission that the OHCHR mentioned in its report, pushing for special rapporteurs to come and visit India, pushing for working groups to talk about Kashmir, and not just, we've had one Security Council meeting behind closed doors pushed for by China on the behest of Pakistan, talking about Kashmir. But other than that, we have seen an international community which is incredibly anemic when it comes to Kashmir, in contrast to how it talks about Palestine, right? And so it's really about narrative building. It's kind of about naming and shaming perpetrators, but also liaising with all of these groups through these reports. And we can have these reports as like, look, this is witness testimony. This is what we have, this being filed here. We've recently seen that there's a Russell Tribunal now for Kashmir, which is a very interesting development also. And the fact that there are some organizations that work here, when we're talking about Palestine and we're talking about Kashmir, there are two of the oldest conflicts inscribed in UN Security Council resolutions. So the oldest UN missions were to Palestine, they were to Kashmir. And at the same time, I'm like, where is the mission for India and Pakistan? UNMOGIP. I never hear anything about them. I've read report after report about Kashmir, and yet I never hear about them collecting evidence, collecting data, and kind of publishing it. So it's about having these organizations there, but also liaising with them and being like, hey, what are you doing for the Kashmiri people? And in terms of whether we're going to see an Indian in the docket anytime soon from the security forces which are operating in Kashmir, I doubt it. I also really doubt it, just because of the political will. We're talking about trade deals with India. India is a huge economy, and nobody really wants to get on their bad side. And we've seen that under this new Hindutva fascist government, they really don't tolerate that anything being said about the fact that they are pretty much a fascist state. So at the same time, we are going to continue to see quite an anemic response. But I think in terms of narrative building, what needs to be done is the same as has been done in the Israel case, which is that you push for a BDS movement. We are going to push for boycott, divestment, sanctions, and we're going to do that in every possible available forum. And that's what needs to happen with Kashmir. And when we're naming and shaming perpetrators, the report didn't actually name and shame anyone, but I understand that has been given to the Met Office, so all of those names and all of the shaming has been done in confidential documents. But even those that we do know about and that have been mentioned, such as the army official who strapped a Kashmiri onto his Jeep and used him as a human shield to parade through the streets in Jammu and Kashmir. That person was mentioned in the OHCHR report. It was mentioned as a footnote, but we know his name. We know that he is Lethal Gogoi, and that is something that he did, which is a war crime in occupied territory. So how do we go about getting those perpetrators and being like, if you end up on any kind of soil of a country which does, pursue universal jurisdiction cases, then we will have people pushing for those states to continue to do that and to bring cases against people like this. And a lot of the time we don't really see names of perpetrators being brought out. We see that it's, the Rush 3 rifle, someone from there. And that's why it's so important to liaise with civil society organizations and to do work like Stoke White did when they go to Kashmir and talk about it, because then you have perpetrators being brought to the fore, and that is really what we need.
No, that definitely is something for us to consider, particularly, you kind of meshing in, particularly those organizations that you mentioned. I think that's very key, that yearly report that's issued by that group. And I think that adds on to that. But you mentioned something about the economic pressure or the economic intimidation with India and that. And I wanted to pull Alex into this conversation based on also what Khalil had said earlier about lawfare. Now, we understand these economic implications that, the Indian, obviously, economy is very much intertwined with a lot of nations, particularly even the United Kingdom, of course, and that, obviously any action done here, like you mentioned, would then react, and then there would be, one for one, and then that would create a scenario that, possibly UK politically wants to avoid. Now, the mentioning of lawfare by Khalil is that, obviously the Indians have been, kind of using this as a way to kind of tackle these challenges and avoid them from coming out to the front. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what this lawfare is? I mean, it's a new concept, it's a developing concept, and I know as an international law expert, you're kind of well versed a little bit about this. So tell us a little bit about this lawfare and how it may be, and how India has used it in the context, of course, it's cited in this report, and what its implications are as a result of that.
Yeah, well, lawfare is something that's emerged in the last 10, 15 years or so as a concept. I'm not convinced that what India is doing is necessarily actually lawfare. I'll explain why in a second. I'm not suggesting what they're doing is right, but I think we'll give it a different title. Lawfare is when a state under the influence of the military basically decides that it can use international law to gain propaganda and other kinds of advantages, right? The most famous example that probably sticks in everybody's head is when somebody committed suicide in Guantanamo Bay, and one of the military officers who was responsible for the United States said it was an act of asymmetrical warfare, right? That was exactly how he described it. And that's kind of a sort of a lawfare response, which is, instead of saying somebody killed themselves because they're obviously, desperate and being mistreated, we categorize what they did as a form of attack against us, and then we can, respond. We don't have to do anything, right? This person wasn't really suffering. They killed themselves because they wanted to be a martyr, and therefore it's not our responsibility to worry about. That, I think, is an example of lawfare. Lawfare is also things like things that's happened now that we take for granted almost, the way that journalists are embedded with militaries now. They just have to swallow whatever they're told, pretty much. And the footage we've seen over the last 20 years during the war on terror raises huge questions about, the level to which the military has essentially taken over the humanitarian law aspects. The military should have a section that's devoted to humanitarian law, which is ensuring that their soldiers and service personnel are obeying the rules of the Geneva Conventions, et cetera, et cetera. The suspicion is that that is no longer actually controlling anybody. It's being controlled by the rest of the military. And the military is saying, what can you do for us? And they're saying, oh, we can do this, right? We can preemptively describe what's going to happen in a certain way. And so it's that idea that you use, rather than international law being a mechanism for restraining militaries, it becomes a mechanism they use to achieve propaganda victories, right? And this is something that's been going on. I said that the term lawfare is relatively recent, but the way that the media were controlled, the first conflict where it really happened was the Gulf War in 1991, where the Americans had learned from their experience in Vietnam. Vietnam produced some terribly striking images. There's that image of the man being with a revolver to his head. There's the girl running through the streets having been burnt by napalm. There's the My Lai massacre that everybody who studied Vietnam knows about. And so there was this attempt to say, rather than the media exposing what we're doing as being wrong, we must control the agenda. And obviously during the war on terror, that took place more. The reason I say I don't think that's happening in India is because maybe it is a bit, but what I more see is simply just refusal to acknowledge anything. It's just stony silence from India. Nothing happens that's of any interest, in Kashmir, and it's none of your business, even if it does, more or less. And there may be elements of lawfare in there, but I think that's what I would describe it more as, just refusal to acknowledge that anything is going on. More than lawfare. I think there'll be bits of lawfare, but it's not as clear as in other cases.
Well, yeah, okay, go ahead, Aisha, you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to say I'm kind of a little bit wary of the use of the term lawfare as well, especially, how it came about. Charles Dunlap was like, how do we, justify the killing of more civilians than can be justified under the laws of war? This is called lawfare. And I also disagree that India is really doing that. It's not really using law to achieve strategic means. It is just doing whatever it wants to do. And, the laws that have been enforced over the past decades giving impunity, those are the laws through which they're just doing what the laws there are meant to do. I wouldn't really describe it as lawfare either.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of being a little bit on the counter position here, and I would like Khalil to comment because he mentions it in his report as well, a little bit clarity on this position. But let's take what Alex's point is on the journalists and the narrative building. Clearly, we know that the journalist voices, the independent journalist voices, are being stifled. There's a certain narrative that the Indian government wants to promote in Kashmir, and they are forcefully doing it to the extent that they're disappearing people, killing people, and only people who get access to it. I mean, even a U.S. senator can't get access there. So it goes to show you that they are physically preventing independent reporting. Just like Khalil mentioned that there's this lawyer that's really active. Everybody knows him. Immediately after this report is published, boom, he's arrested. So this sort of intimidation, that does not feed into that. And maybe Khalil, you can shed more light about these journalists, because I know that you've probably engaged with a lot, and of course you can't tell certain names obviously for their own safety and security, but perhaps you can actually illustrate to us some of the challenges that they had in this respect, and possibly that could be an argument. The other thing with what Aisha mentioned is that how they're just doing what they're doing, but they are also using law or Indian law to justify that. So for example, what they did with the Article 370 and removing the autonomous condition. And if people study history about the Maharaja, that was the reason he caused dissension, was and agreed to it, was based on Article 370. And now that that's removed, it raises the question of is the ascension still in place? And there's a lot of those. And of course, you mentioned the self-determination issue. And is law being used to stifle that aspect? So Khalil, if you could shed light on that, because I know you mentioned it in your report, perhaps this position.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's important to go back to the notion of lawfare, because number one, on the ground in Kashmir, there is lawfare. It's documented. And it's very important to understand what lawfare is. There's a really good book by Professor David Kennedy at Harvard who actually taught me about lawfare. Lawfare is not necessarily only about law, number one. Lawfare is about the institutions, the logistics, the physical landscape, as well as the policies, as well as the attitudes, as well as the structures of violence that are created within an environment to control, quote unquote, the other. And that's very important to mention. The book that I was talking about is called Of War and Law. It's not only about war, it also provides a lot of examples, including Guantanamo Bay, which was also mentioned. And the Guantanamo example, I disagree with, because that wasn't an act of lawfare. Some Guantanamo detainees recently were, because of the 20-year anniversary, were interviewed regarding their experience and what they would do. For example, they would excrement in front of the guards. They were asked on their webinar recently, why did you do that? And they said it was the only form of resistance we had in the structures that we were under. So I don't think that would class as lawfare. And also Guantanamo detainees killing themselves, I think is a loose view, but we need to understand, and the reason why the SWI unit is involved here is because we look into the broader sense of the conflicts. If we are only looking at this as lawyers, then we can stop the discussion, and then we will be content with our, our parameters that we have. But we have to go beyond law. There's a war studies hat, there's an anthropology hat, there's a conflict analysis hat. We all must merge and amalgamate together to understand the violence that's taking place in Kashmir. Otherwise, it's very easy to pick up the Geneva Conventions, go through every single article, find something, but then you're going to miss hundreds of violations taking place. And the war on terror is a good example of that, actually, because there are violations taking place not only in conflict zones, but I'll bring you back to asymmetric warfare, where violations are taking place also domestically in peacetime. So then we're not talking about laws of war violations, we're talking about a different type of violation. And then if you look at, for example, Canada, America, or a European country, even the UK, there are violations taking place which, international law doesn't actually apply, but there are violations and abuses taking place. So the way and the manner in which we see the violence is important. So we're moving into more of a criminology hat now. And the reason why that's important is because only through a broader lens will we be able to appreciate the violence endured by the Kashmiris. And let me now turn to the law to justify my position. The structure of violence is instrumentalized by the use of war and law in Kashmir. And it makes way for a sophisticated lawfare environment specifically designed to degrade the Kashmiris. There is no other purpose but just to degrade them as a human, considering them as the other by all possible means that they have in Indian occupied Kashmir. And there's hundreds of examples. I'm ready to bust open with everything that I have seen. And I've spoken to people, and it's really laughable in some situations. Of particular concern with the laws that have been enacted are, for example, the Unlawful Activity Prevention Act, 1967, or the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act, 1978. And it goes further, the Armed Forces Jammu and Kashmir Special Powers Act, 1990. And then on top of all of these laws that have been created specifically for a war paradigm, a conflict paradigm, for control and violence, which if we go into the testimonies, there was no such violence. It's just peaceful activities, whether it's journalism, whether it's human rights defense. Khurram Parvez, for example, he's been detained under terrorism for human rights defending, okay? So this is lawfare, this is an act of lawfare. They're trying to suppress activists on the ground from doing work which, if you were to look at it under international law perspective, might come under self-determination, might come under legitimate lawyering, might come under legitimate even journalism, right? There was a young guy called Sajad Gull I've been speaking to over the last year, and I know a lot about his life. And he's been harassed every single week. He's harassed, not just him, but also his family, which not a lot of people know, to the extent that he used to sleep in his clothes that he would go out in. He knew that he would one day be raided, and he actually tweeted that a couple of days before he was raided, and he's missing to this day. But I think it's important to also understand that whilst there is lawfare by the Indian government instrumentalized within Kashmir, there is an overarching layer of abuse that we also need to discuss, which the tentacles are so far reaching that it actually, in effect, is commanding the lawfare within Kashmir. Totally unreported, totally unseen, but the SWI unit has effectively uncovered. And this is the use of the war on terror rhetoric. And we've seen this with former defense officers effectively quoting that they should follow the ways of the American way just after 9/11 to control to control the Kashmiris. They've even created camps to de-radicalize Kashmiris. We are talking about a system, a framework of violence, which is being furthered in Kashmir. It didn't start in Kashmir, the war on terror. The war on terror has no connection with Kashmir. There is zero connection of the quote unquote armed attack on 9/11 on the IHO. Kashmir. None of the armed groups have connection there. Same goes to Somalia, same goes to Yemen, okay? But the same lawfare that the Americans use, for example, the authorization for the use of military force around the world for perpetual violence, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, Somalia, it's also being utilized in Kashmir. So counterterrorism, can you really say that someone who is protesting peacefully after Friday prayers today, for example, maybe it's happening now, it's something customarily done in Kashmir, and if you're arrested now, let's say an 11-year-old boy has been arrested, that he is now going to be charged under counterterrorism. And someone who is doing legitimate journalism work, for example, reporting on a demolition drive and pushing people out of their homes, be counterterrorism? Can human rights defending be counterterrorism? So the way we see the lawfare is very important, and we can't only see it as law, because it's not just law, it's more than law, it's global orders as well. Lawfare is global orders, it's institutions.
Can I just add something there? That I wasn't suggesting that the people committing suicide in Guantanamo Bay were engaging in lawfare. I was suggesting that when the American response is that that's asymmetric warfare, that's lawfare, right? That's saying that what they're doing is somehow an attack on us, and we can justify it using some, it's part of the campaign they've been waging against us, and therefore we can justify it under self-defense, whatever else you want to say. And the other thing is that I tell you what you say about the Indians passing lots of laws for the area, but they would presumably be able to carry out the human rights abuses irrespective of whether they passed the laws anyway. They'd do it without those laws. So we slightly differ on, I think, what lawfare is there. I think it's mostly about the use of international legal mechanisms to achieve that kind of repression. But having said that, I don't disagree with anything you said as well about thinking with a wider lens. I'm a lawyer and I look through a legal lens. It's not always the best answer. Do you want my political opinion? I think one of the problems is I don't think people care about Kashmir around the world. I mean, this has already been said. There is no movement like there is for Palestine. And that's something that I think Pakistan and others have to do, including all of us, is we need to be much better at explaining it to people.
Okay. That's a good final thought in that sense, and I would like Aisha to also give her final thoughts in respect to that. Now, Alex mentions that we should make more efforts on this, and what else can be done, and how we can add to it. Particularly, your mentioning of self-determination, and then is that the solution? So, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. I also want to say that I completely agree with most of what Khalil was saying. I also think that David Kennedy is amazing. I think that book is also incredible and made me totally rethink the laws of war, but also that the fact that international law does not leave a vacuum. So if you have the laws of war applying, when they don't apply, the laws of peace do apply, and human rights law is far more stringent actually than even the laws of war, even if we accept that they both apply in tandem during an armed conflict. But the idea is that if we are ever talking about a vacuum, we've almost also bought into what these armies which go into Iraq with 3,000, I think, lawyers with them to try and legitimize the violence that they term legal. But I do just want to say that this is at its essence about the right to self-determination of Kashmiris, and that is something that we have to push for in terms of that they have the right to decide this themselves. I want to end really by talking about the elections that are going on in terms of the delimitation, and I think that that's something that is really, really not being talked about enough. The fact that India is kind of just making good on its promise to make Kashmir part of its territory proper, and the fact that it is doing so by eroding Kashmir's right to self-determination. It's already doing a demographic transfer by, allowing people to buy land, buy property, and to move into the area and become, Kashmiri, and also by changing the language and adding Hindi as an official language in the territory. It is slowly reconstructing the territory. It's pushing an investment in the form of the UAE has just agreed to give a lot of money in to invest. And it's kind of saying like Kashmir is India and it is open for business, and it is for all of us to say that it is not open for business and it is not part of India. It is disputed territory. And in order to facilitate and to allow Kashmiris to realize their right to self-determination, there has to be a plebiscite in line with Security Council resolutions. And that is something that we will push for. Up until then, it is a disputed territory, and India has no right over it and has no claim to it. And that is why it has to station 600, 800,000 of its security forces in what is the most militarized region in the entire world. And I think that just shocks me. Every time I read that statistic, I'm incredibly shocked that in a region of 7 million people, you have 700,000 security forces. That's 1 for every 10 Kashmiri. And I think that's insane. And I think that is just symbolic of the fact that Kashmiris do not want the Indian army there. They do not see themselves as Indian, and they need to be allowed to exercise their right to self-determination. And as an international community, we have entirely failed them. The Security Council especially, the UN especially, and that is something that we need to do whatever we can to try and change.
Thank you. No, I think those are really interesting thoughts. And Khalil, I want to give you the last word, since this was your report and your effort, and a lot of things that Aisha mentioned. She also mentioned earlier about similar BDS movement, and I think, and you mentioned in the report also about the Israeli engagement in this as well, where other nations are also involved, and this pressure building point. Like, can this report be used in the context of encouraging or pressuring other nations to not trade, particularly in Kashmir? Dealing with that, particularly, business and economics. And that's always a factor that, plays very seriously. And the BDS movement is taken seriously by the Israeli government, and they do make efforts to counter it in various ways. So what are your thoughts around that? And what our listeners, particularly our young listeners, particularly our law students who are watching this, what can they take away from this report and how they can add on to it to bring change?
Yeah, sure. Really enjoyed this session. I think it was really great. Kashmir is not spoken enough in the UK, particularly in the UK. There isn't a lot going on about Kashmir, particularly in our law schools as well, and even international relations studies. Generally, I think it's a good movement that we have from a human rights defending perspective that should be built on. And there are many things you can do. Some of them, different organizations, perhaps not law firms, but can work on the economic side. But that's something that we don't necessarily deal with. Just as my last comment, I wanted to mention, UN documents, they reference India and Kashmir as a lawless state in all of their reports, including the latest one. And when we say disputed territory, it's very important because the UN's position is quite clear about this. It generally doesn't take a side, it's quite impartial. But it's quite clear that they are pointing towards a preference towards the Kashmiris regarding Kashmir, particularly from my reading as well as our council as well. And then I would like to bring this back to the abrogation of Article 370, 35A 2019 onwards, where they increased the military might as well as I would argue an act of lawfare, right? They didn't, as Alex would say, they wouldn't need to do this. It's an occupation. But the fact that they did invoke it shows you an act of lawfare. Why would they need to do that? Another act of lawfare, which I would like to end on to bring the human side of what we have seen, is that there has been cases that we were documenting of people who've had their daughters kidnapped by the Indian police or army, as well as their son's 8-year-old son being shot outside their home, typically on a Thursday or a Friday, and they've gone to the police station. And whilst that's quite a normal thing to do, you would have police officers refusing to file an FIR, which is the first information report, refusing to document that, refusing to give a reference number. This is unheard of. I've never heard about this before in any, kind of occupation. I know in Palestine, it doesn't happen, right? But in Kashmir, they have these law enforcement structures within the occupied territory. And they almost kind of portray that they are governing the plains, but the manner in which they are governing the plains is highly telling with regards to the law enforcement, including the political rhetoric, which influences people on the ground, which is also part of our evidence base, which we have captured audio as well as videos, utilizing open source intelligence submitted to the UK Met. We do plan to publish these things in the future because we understand that a wave of discussion is taking place, and of course, on the 5th of February. But to continue the discussion, I think the best way to do that in the context of Kashmir is to continue researching and investigating and documenting cases legally as possible.
All right, thank you. And with that, we end this session. And though there's so much to talk about, I mean, within the report, I highly encourage, we'll share the link with the report with this so that our viewers and listeners can go read it for themselves. I highly encourage, particularly law students, to understand the evidence and the level of documentation. Truly, it is the single most detailed documentation of what's going on the ground in Kashmir since 2019. And I think this is an amazing work, a step in the right direction, I think, for all of us. And this Kashmir Day on February 5th, particularly for those viewers and listeners who are in Pakistan, we know how important this is in the sense of not only for this country, but in general human rights concerns, why we show solidarity with the Kashmiri people in this, as we have been showing since the beginning of our independence in 1947. And I think the baton and responsibility falls on the Pakistanis more than anyone else, though definitely as international law does govern all of us, and all states do have a responsibility as a neighbor, as a people with similar history, the culture and the context. There is an extra effort that's required, particularly not only in Kashmir, but also in Afghanistan, in the sense because we're neighbors to these regions. And therefore, well, with that, I can say this much as a human, as when we talk about human rights, we have to put in an effort for our fellow humans, for our fellow Kashmiris. And there's a saying that's very symbolic that Prophet Muhammad says, that I think is very poignant for this when we talk about this, is that when you see something wrong, you should do something about it. And if you can't, speak out against it. And if you can't do that, at least feel bad about it in your hearts. And that is the weakest of faith. And I think that's a very important note to end on, that, if you can't do anything about it, at least speak about it. And if you can't, at least, understand it and feel bad about it. And at least that's something that you can, do extend your support to the Kashmiris who really, look to their fellow human beings across the world to understand their plea. And they risked, their lives, and the people who communicated with Khalil and the team at Stoke White, and some are as possibly suffering as a result of sharing this, to make sure they got out to let us know around the world what's going on. And it's our duty now that we know that we will be responsible on how we take this knowledge and help assist them. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Khalil and Aisha as well. And hopefully we'll have another.
Thank you very much.
In the past, and really looking forward to working with Stoke White in the future, and anything that we can do for the Ziauddin Faculty of Law, Politics and Governance. We're here. Alex is here at the Center for International Law and Constitutional Law, and really looking forward to it.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure sharing the platform with all of you.